The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not pine dust, not motor oil, not the faint cedar scent that had lived in the corners of my house for years because my wife Miriam used to tuck hand-cut strips into drawers and closets and say it made a place feel cared for. This smell was chemical, antiseptic, airless, hollow, the kind of smell meant to scrub a room clean of all evidence that human life had ever been lived there. I opened my eyes and stared at a ceiling painted that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature and everywhere people are meant to feel manageable. I did not move right away. I spent 42 years building things for a living: houses, additions, workshops, storefront fit-outs. The work teaches you something very practical. Before you act, you assess. You look at the room. You understand the structure. You figure out what's wrong before you put your weight on anything. So I lay still and looked. There was a window with a curtain the color of old mustard. There was a television bolted too high on the wall. There was a tray table with a plastic cup of water and 2 tablets in a folded paper cup. There was a call button hanging over a metal bed rail. And there was a door with a narrow strip of reinforced glass. And through that strip I could see fluorescent lighting, a nurse's station, and the shiny emptiness of a corridor built for control. I sat up slowly. My head felt packed with wet insulation. My mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. I was wearing a hospital gown, and I had no memory of putting it on. The door opened before my feet hit the floor. A woman in navy scrubs came in with a clipboard. She smiled at me with the careful patience of someone used to disorientation in others. "Good morning," she said. "How are we feeling today?" "Where am I?" My voice sounded rough and older than it had any right to. She set the clipboard down. "You're at Willow Creek Behavioral Institute," she said. "You've been here 4 days." I stared at her. 4 days? "Yes." She tilted her head. "Do you remember arriving?" I did not. The last thing I remembered clearly was Sunday evening at my own house in Virginia. My daughter had come over for supper. She had brought a casserole, which she had been doing more and more often lately. She had been solicitous, attentive, fussing over me in a way I'd taken at the time for concern. I remembered eating on the back porch. I remembered the evening going soft over the trees. I remembered feeling unusually tired. After that, nothing. A blank stretch, no ambulance, no car ride, no admission desk, no signatures. Just absence, then that ceiling. "I need my phone," I said. "I'm calling my daughter." The nurse's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The smile stayed, but the eyes got more careful. "Your daughter is listed as your emergency contact. I can let her know you're awake." "No," I said. "I want to call her myself." It took another 10 minutes, but eventually she brought me a facility handset and left me in the room with it. I called my daughter, Natalie. She answered on the second ring. The first thing she said was not hello. It was, "Dad, please don't get upset." In 69 years, I had heard many things I didn't want to hear. I had stood in an oncology corridor while a doctor told me my wife's cancer had spread further than they expected. I had watched my father lose his lumber yard when I was young enough to still believe adults could prevent all disasters by wanting to. I had heard hard truths delivered in many voices, but there was something about those 6 words, the rehearsed calm in them, the way they arrived already braced for resistance. It hit me somewhere very cold. "Natalie," I said, "what have you done?" She explained it to me in the slow, gentle voice people use when they want tone to substitute for honesty. She said she had been worried for months. She said I had been forgetting things, that I had called her twice one night and not remembered the first call, that I seemed confused, that I had gotten fixated on a few things lately and she had spoken with a doctor, that she had my power of attorney, that she had made some difficult decisions because someone had to. Then she said the part that mattered most. "The house is already in process, Dad. It's better this way." The house is already in process. I sat there on the edge of that bed in a locked psychiatric facility outside Greenville, South Carolina, more than 300 miles from my home in Rockbridge County, Virginia, and listened to my own daughter explain to me why my life had already been moved without my consent. "Come get me," I said. "Dad, come get me today. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am not staying here." She inhaled softly, the way she used to before she said something she thought was reasonable and knew I wouldn't like. "They need to finish the evaluation." "There is no evaluation." "There is, Dad. And this is for your safety." "For my safety?" She went silent for a second. Then she said, "You'll understand this eventually." That was when I ended the call. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I didn't threaten. I hung up, picked up the 2 tablets from the paper cup, walked into the bathroom, and flushed them down the toilet. I am not a dramatic man. I need that understood. I built houses for a living. I ran crews. I framed roofs in January wind and spent August afternoons in half-finished rooms with no ventilation. The work does not permit melodrama. Boards are straight, or they aren't. Foundations hold, or they fail. Problems are solved by seeing them clearly. So I stood in that little bathroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision. I was going to treat this the way I had treated every bad sight I had ever inherited from a fool. Assess, plan, execute. What I knew: I was in a behavioral facility far from home. My daughter had invoked a power of attorney. She had said the house was already in process. I had no wallet, no keys, no phone, no car, no idea what story had been told about me. What I did not know: everything else. The first thing I did was stop taking the medication. Whatever they were giving me in those little paper cups was making my thoughts slow and soft around the edges, and I needed my mind back. The second thing I did was start paying attention to people. One of the great advantages of getting old is that people underestimate what you are doing when you are quiet. They mistake politeness for passivity. They think because you are not making a scene, you are not building a map. I talk to everyone. The young man who brought meals. The night nurse with a dachshund sticker on her badge. The activities woman who liked me because I could fix the loose leg on a card table without being asked. The orderly who complained about the coffee every morning as if it were a sacred duty. I did not tell them I had been kidnapped. I did not accuse the facility of wrongdoing. I did not rant. I was courteous. I asked names. I remembered details. I gave them the version of myself that was easiest to trust. Calm, practical, cooperative, slightly amused by the world. And while they talked, I listened. By the end of the first week, with the pills disappearing into the plumbing every morning, the fog had begun to lift. By the middle of the second, it was almost completely gone. By the end of the second week, I had learned enough to understand the shape of the trap. Willow Creek had admitted me on paperwork, signed by a doctor named Calvin Bryce. I had never heard of Calvin Bryce. My physician for the past 17 years had been Dr. Howard Mercer in Lexington, a man who knew my blood pressure history, the year I had my gallbladder removed, the exact date Miriam's biopsy came back malignant, and the fact that I still refused statins because they made my knees hurt. Dr. Calvin Bryce was not my doctor. He was, I later learned, not really anyone's doctor anymore. His Virginia license had been suspended nearly 3 years earlier over billing fraud and record falsification, which made him an odd but very useful choice for anyone needing medical authority on paper without actual examination getting in the way. The file at Willow Creek described me as showing marked cognitive decline, episodes of disorientation, and escalating paranoid ideation. It said I posed a danger to myself due to confusion and impaired judgment. Those phrases were smooth, clinical, designed to turn theft into care. My power of attorney was real. I had signed it 12 years earlier when Miriam first got sick, and I was trying to get every paper in our lives in order in case one of us lost the ability to handle things. It was meant to protect us from chaos, not create it. It gave Natalie certain powers if I became incapacitated. Apparently, she had decided incapacity was a decision she was allowed to make on my behalf. My house, the house I built in 1992 on 4 acres outside Fairfield, Virginia, with my own hands and Miriam's eye for every detail I would have missed, had been listed for sale 9 days after I arrived at Willow Creek. 9 days. I sat with that for a very long time. The workshop alone held 3 decades of my life. The back porch was where Miriam and I had drunk coffee every morning for 21 years. The kitchen window over the sink looked onto the walnut tree she loved because the cardinals nested there in spring. The hallway still held the old photographs I had never moved because she had placed them exactly where she wanted them. None of that mattered on a property disclosure form. It mattered to me enough that I had to stand up and pace the room to stay out of my own head. I needed someone outside this, someone Natalie had not neutralized. I thought of Carl Benson. Carl lived just under a mile away, retired from the telephone company, 74, widower. We had been neighbors for 27 years. We had keys to each other's houses. We checked on each other's pumps in winter and hauled brush together after storms. He had the useful flaw of noticing things other people preferred to ignore. Natalie had never liked Carl. She said he commented too much. She said he was nosy. She said he involved himself in things that did not concern him. Exactly. I asked the night nurse if I could call a friend. She said yes, and set me up in a small consultation room with a landline and, either through kindness or oversight, left me there alone. Carl answered on the 3rd ring. I told him where I was. I told him what I knew. Then I asked him for 3 things. First, go to my property and tell me what you see. Second, find me a lawyer. Not a general lawyer. An elder law attorney who handled abuse of authority, involuntary facility placement, and emergency court intervention. Third, tell nobody. Not Natalie. Not anyone close to Natalie. Not until I said otherwise. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Tom, I knew something was wrong 2 weeks ago. He told me what he had seen. A realtor's lockbox on my front door. A moving lorry in the drive. Men carrying boxes out of the house. Not careful movers. A clearance crew. He had called Natalie, and she told him I had decided to move closer to her in Roanoke because being alone had become too much for me. She sounded believable, he said. Almost. What gave her away? A pause. The bird feeder, he said. Miriam's bird feeder. They'd taken it down. And I thought no. Tom would never have let that go. He was right. I would not have. Carl found the lawyer in less than a day. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She drove down from Charlottesville on a Thursday morning in a dark suit and low heels and spent 3 hours with me in a private room. She asked exact questions and did not waste one of them. When I finished telling her everything, from the casserole dinner to the missing days to the call, she sat back and said, "This is not guardianship. This is unlawful confinement dressed in family paperwork." She reviewed the facility file. She spoke with a staff psychiatrist named Dr. Ravi Patel, a quiet, deliberate man who had already begun to suspect that my presentation did not match the story in my chart. Then she explained exactly where things stood. The power of attorney did not allow Natalie to simply declare me incompetent because it suited her. It required lawful activation through legitimate medical evidence and good faith use. I had never been adjudicated incapacitated. There had been no court proceeding, no neutral physician, no hearing, no review. Natalie had taken a document meant to protect me in a real emergency and used it to manufacture one. The house had been listed at $510,000. The county valuation from the previous tax year put it at $680,000. The buyer was a man named Darren Pike. I did not know the name. Margaret did. Darren Pike was the business partner of Natalie's husband, Andrew. They had not even bothered to bury the connection. Then Dr. Patel ordered my intake toxicology results pulled again and reviewed line by line. That changed everything. The blood panel from the day I arrived showed elevated levels of lorazepam, not a small dose. Not a prescribed therapeutic trace, not anything explainable by accident. It was the kind of level that suggested repeated administration over a short period. Lorazepam, given to an older man without his knowledge, produces confusion, fatigue, impaired memory, and exactly the kind of slow, frightened disorientation that can pass for cognitive decline to anyone inclined to believe a convenient story. Dr. Patel read the results, read the admission notes, read my file again, and made a decision. He called administration. Administration called legal. Legal called the licensing board and the county court. And suddenly the neatness of Natalie's plan had a crack in it she had not anticipated. A physician with ethics and a paper trail. Margaret filed an emergency petition for my release on Friday. The hearing happened the following Monday. The judge reviewed the petition, Dr. Patel's assessment, the toxicology findings, and the licensing status of Dr. Calvin Bryce. I was released on Tuesday at 2:15 p.m., exactly 31 days after I had been admitted. Carl drove down to get me. He brought coffee in a thermos, 2 country ham biscuits from a place just outside Spartanburg, and the good sense not to fill the drive home with pity. By the time we crossed back into Virginia and the late autumn light spread itself over the foothills in that blue-gold way our state still knows how to do, something in my chest unclenched for the first time in a month. Then we pulled into my driveway. The house was empty. I do not mean merely vacant. I mean stripped. No sofa, no dining table, no refrigerator, no stove, no washer or dryer, no workshop tools. 30 years of hand tools gone. The compressor, my router table, miter saw, boxes of hardware I had organized by type and size, and a cast iron table saw my father gave me when he retired and said, "A man ought to own one machine he trusts more than most people." Gone. Miriam's things were gone too. The cedar chest at the foot of our bed, the quilts, the framed family photographs from the hall, her mother's china, the Christmas linens, the old silver she polished every December whether anyone was coming or not, and outside the kitchen window, where the walnut tree stood exactly where it always had, the bird feeder was gone. Just an empty hook. I stood in that kitchen and looked at the bare hook and the walnut tree beyond it and felt the kind of pain that is too specific to call simple grief. Then I walked back outside, got into Carl's truck and said, "Take me to Margaret." What she had assembled in the 31 days between my confinement and my release was enough to make even me sit back in my chair. Natalie had been planning it for months. Phone records showed repeated contact with Calvin Bryce nearly 9 months before I was taken. 6 months of calls with Darren Pike. 3 months of escalating contact between Natalie and Andrew in the weeks before that Sunday dinner. Then Margaret asked me about the casserole. Did it taste strange? Was I unusually thirsty? How quickly had I become tired? I remembered the cream sauce being too salty and faintly bitter. I remembered drinking a great deal of water. I remembered struggling to keep my eyes open by 8:30, which had seemed odd even then. The lorazepam in my system was consistent with repeated doses over at least 72 hours. The Sunday dinner had not been the only time. It had been the start. There was another player, too. A pharmacy technician in Roanoke who had supplied the medication without a valid prescription for money that turned out to be embarrassingly little. Evil is often cheaper than people imagine. When investigators found him, he cooperated almost immediately. The sale of my house had not yet closed. A title issue unrelated to any of this, some old right-of-way discrepancy from the 1990s, had delayed the transfer by just enough days for Margaret to secure an injunction. Bureaucracy, for once, saved me. The contents of the house were another matter. Much of it had been moved into a storage unit outside Roanoke. Some had already been sold at a downsizing estate event Natalie had arranged and advertised online. Some of my tools had been sold to a dealer. The appliances had gone to a warehouse reseller. My father's table saw had been sold to a private buyer who never answered a single inquiry. Margaret pursued everything that could reasonably be pursued. Not all of it came back. Most of it did. We recovered the storage unit on a Wednesday. Carl came with me. So did two of his grandsons, both good boys, 17 and 19, strong enough to lift, quiet enough to know when silence was respect. Margaret's cedar chest was in the back of the unit with her own handwriting still on a strip of tape across the lid. The moment I saw it, I sat down right there on the concrete and stayed still for a while. Carl's grandsons didn't say a word. That meant more to me than they knew. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. The toxicology results were conclusive. The fake doctor was easy to impeach. The pharmacy technician folded. The phone records were ugly. The real estate scheme was too direct to explain away. Natalie was arrested on a Thursday morning at her home. Andrew was arrested at his office the same day. I attended every hearing I was allowed to attend. I sat in that courtroom and watched my daughter, my only child, the girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway, the woman who had stood beside me in a hospital corridor when Miriam died, sit at the defense table while the Commonwealth laid out how she had sedated me, transported me, confined me, and attempted to liquidate everything I owned. People like the clean version of stories like this, the version where the wronged man feels only righteous fury, where the betrayer becomes a simple monster. That is not how it was. I was furious, yes. But I was also grieving. Not only for Miriam, not only for the life interrupted. I was grieving the death of what I had believed about my daughter. That is its own kind of funeral. Her lawyer tried to argue that Natalie had truly believed I was declining and had acted out of frightened love. The toxicology made that nearly impossible to sustain. It is difficult to portray yourself as a panicked caregiver when the evidence says you fed your father sedatives over several days and signed him into a psychiatric facility hundreds of miles from home using the help of a defrocked physician and your husband's business partner. Natalie received 8 years. Andrew received 5. The pharmacy technician, for full cooperation, received 18 months. Calvin Bryce received probation, lifetime medical disqualification, and enough public ruin to ensure he would spend the rest of his life being introduced by his own disgrace. 8 years. I thought about that number the whole drive home after sentencing. Carl drove, the same way he had driven me to most of the hearings. After a long silence, he asked, "You going to be all right?" I looked out at the road. I thought about the house, which I had moved back into 6 weeks after my release, about the kitchen window, about the walnut tree, about the bird feeder, which Carl and I rehung the afternoon we brought Margaret's things home, about the raised beds in the garden, which still gave me tomatoes that year despite everything, about my grandchildren, who would come for Christmas and carry Margaret's china carefully to the table with the solemnity children reserve for objects they know are sacred. "Yes," I said after a while, "I think I am." And I meant it. Not that I was repaired, but that I was still standing. There are things I know now that I did not know before. I know a power of attorney is not a harmless piece of paper. It is a loaded instrument. It needs limits. Conditions, independent triggers, multiple doctors, specific language, neutral oversight. Margaret has since drafted me a new one with every safeguard she can legally put into it. I know isolation is always the first move. Whatever form elder exploitation takes, financial, medical, emotional, the first step is always separation, distance, restricted calls, managed access, a narrowing of the circle until only the exploiter remains between the victim and the truth. In my case, it was 300 miles and a locked ward. In someone else's case, it may be subtler. A changed password, a missed church visit. A friend quietly told, "He's confused lately." A daughter who answers for her mother too quickly in public. I know that Dr. Patel looked at a lab report and chose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. I know that Margaret Ellis drove across the state to meet a man she had never seen and spent more than a year fighting for him because the law, to her, still meant something. I know that Carl Benson saw an empty hook where a bird feeder should have been and understood that a small missing thing can tell the whole story. And I know that at 68 years old, when someone tried to use my age and my grief and my trust against me, I did not disappear. I paid attention. I stopped taking what they handed me. I asked for the phone. I called the man who would notice what was missing. The bird feeder is back on its hook now. The walnut tree is still there. The view from the kitchen sink has not changed. I am still here. And if you are somewhere right now in a room with a beige ceiling that is not yours, wondering whether anyone is coming, listen carefully. Call the person who would notice one small thing out of place. That is enough to begin. Trust the detail. Trust the instinct that says something is wrong. Trust that age is not weakness. Trust that calm is not surrender. And most of all, trust this. They are counting on your silence more than your confusion. Do not give them that.